You want the short version that grabs you in the chest. Here it is: one expensive gala, one ruined masterpiece, one janitor with a recipe book in her locker, and the whole room realizes they've been applauding somebody else's work for decades. Yeah, that happened. Sit with me for a bit. This is the kind of night that changes everything. My name is Maya Carter. For 3 years I cleaned floors at the Alden Hotel. Night shifts, fluorescent lights, mops that squeaked like a tired chorus. By day, I chopped and prepped at a little soul food spot 2 subway stops away. I'm a single mom. Micah is 8. And if you saw my hands, they'd tell you more than my resume ever could Callus's little burns the map of every overnight shift. I also carried a leather notebook. Inside were recipes written in my grandmother's looping hand, Evelyn Carter, who used to run a kitchen in this very building before they rewrote the history books and locked her out to the service door. The Alden hosted a fundraiser once a year. Seats going for $12,000 a plate, cameras, critics, the kind of night where champagne tastes like currency, and the chandeliers look down like judges. The owner, Eleanor Whitcomb, wore her family name like an armor. She had a laugh that shaved people down, and she had practiced turning cruelty into polite speech. Bless your heart with a razor under the velvet. The executive chef, Clara Dane, had a reputation built on one dish, a saffron lobster bisque that critics called transcendent. Clara's picture was on menus, book covers, glossy profiles. The story they told about the Alden's food had her front and center. 3 hours before the gala, a new prep cook slipped on a puddle. A stock pot swung like a pendulum, and Clara's 4-hour labor of lobster and saffron hit the tile and vanished. 12 lobsters, gold liquid gone. A hush fell so thick you could hear the camera crews breathe. Eleanor's face folded into a shape that could stop a conversation. "We have 15 minutes, Clara. Mr. Pierce specifically asked for that bisque." Mr. Pierce was Samuel Pierce, tech, billionaire philanthropist man with more money than some countries, and tonight his donation was the centerpiece. He had childhood memories that tasted like real food, and no one at the Alden cared to ask whose memories they were until tonight. I was pushing a mop down the service corridor when I heard the crash. The sound made the floor jump under my feet. Frank Delgado, head of maintenance, 42 years in the building, looked at me, and something passed in that look, not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. Frank knew the building's ghosts. He knew stories that had been swept under rugs. He knew my grandmother's name, Evelyn, because Evelyn had trusted him with a leather-bound book the day they put her out the back door. "Find someone who can cook?" Frank said, and when he said it I felt the years fold toward me like a map being opened. I'd carried Evelyn's notes like a secret talisman. "Season with memory, not fear," she used to say. There's a way your hands remember heat and salt and the sound of onions. Cooking for me was not about technique on a resume. It was a conversation with the pantry, with the past. In the prep kitchen, I had what felt like the barest of tools: shrimp shells someone had thrown away, a single lobster tail, a half pint of cream, scraps of aromatics. It would be sacrilege by French standards, blasphemy to some culinary purists. Evelyn taught me how to make a thing of substance from what the world called trash. I closed my eyes, breathed like a person about to say something true, and began. I charred the shells until they gave up the smell of Tide, and iron splashed in brandy until the flames licked the hood. Let saffron bloom in warm cream like a little sun. I added a spoon of white miso, because umami does not belong to a single continent, and 1 drop of bourbon, because sometimes a single drop remembers somebody home. The pot sang low, and my hands moved without thinking, like a memory that had lived under my ribs. Frank stood in the doorway like a guard, keeping the rest of the kitchen from seeing more than they needed to. "Don't tell them I said. Don't make it about me." He just nodded and moved like he'd been waiting for a night that mattered his whole life. In 45 seconds, I strained, ladled, garnished with a seared piece of tail and a whisper of chive oil, and slid the bowl across the counter. Then I pulled my apron off and pushed the mop like I belonged with it. They put the bowl in front of Samuel Pierce. He tasted, paused, and something inside him changed. The spoon hit the porcelain, and he went oddly quiet, like someone who's just found a picture from childhood in an attic. Jean-Pierre Malo, A chef with 3 Michelin stars tasted it, and his eyebrows went high in a way you only see when someone encounters something they can't explain. "This isn't classical," he said. "It's memory." Clara, who had been frantically trying to remake her bisque, looked pale as linen. Then the room smelled of accusation. "Who made this?" Eleanor demanded, and every pair of eyes snapped like a rubber band. Clara pointed fingers shaking. "The janitor in the back prep." The words fell like a gavel. In a heartbeat, the guards were on me and Clara pulled me into an alcove, her voice a low blade. "You don't get to speak. One wrong move and I call security. You have a child, Maya. I can ruin you with a single call." She pressed her nails into my arm so hard I felt the memory of it later as a bruise. They shoved me out the service door like trash, the alley full of the smell of dumpsters and the sound of my breath in my ears. Micah's crayon drawing slid from my pocket and a guard booted it, leaving a black smudge across the words, "Best chef in the world. My mom." I sat on cold brick and let myself be small for a minute. I'd been taught to be small. Grandmothers buckle you into silence so the world can breathe easier. But Frank didn't let it end there. He picked up that paper, he walked into the ballroom, and he did what very few people with keys to closets of secrets ever do. He told the truth. He set Evelyn's old notebook on the table open to pages written in her handwriting recipes dated decades before Clara was even a sous chef in training. He said, plain as a bell, "Evelyn Carter was head of this kitchen. She taught many cooks here. She wrote these, and they took her work without giving her the name." Samuel Pierce stood up, the billionaire who had stopped tasting and started remembering, and he said something that surprised everyone. "Bring her back." He was shaking, and I understood why there are some perfumes that only a grandmother can bottle, and he'd been thirsty for that taste since he was a boy in a small town. They brought me into the light of 200 phones and 1,000 faces, and for the first time in a long time, I heard Evelyn's name said with respect. Samuel asked me to cook again, right there in front of everyone. I said I would, but I would cook how my hands remembered. Not to win a trophy, but to tell a story. I made the braised short ribs Evelyn used to make when the refrigerator was empty and the heart needed warming coffee in the rub to add a dark crust ginger and star anise for a ghost note, a long, slow patience that most restaurants can't pay for. When Samuel ate, he closed his eyes and cried. Jean-Pierre stood whispered, "Madame, I cook for presidents and I have no business making this." People clapped like they were applauding memory itself. Video spread. The hashtag #HatMop2Menu started as a joke and turned into a headline. The internet found what the dining room thought it could, hide a history of stealing and erasing. The next days were a blur. A newspaper with Evelyn's recipes on the front page, phone calls demanding investigations, a board meeting where the owner had to choose dignity over denial. And she chose denial and left. Clara's reputation cracked. Some lost their jobs, some found new courage. Months later, Samuel put money behind a simple idea. A kitchen where people who were good with their hands but poor on paper could learn, work, and teach. We opened a restaurant, The Hearth, and it was messy and loud and honest, and we hired folks who'd been told for years they didn't belong. We named a small training program after Evelyn. Micah came to the opening and asked me if I was really a chef now. I nodded and handed him a spoon. "I'm telling you this because people ask me what changed. Was it the billionaire, the hashtag, the notebook? Those things mattered, but the real shift was the refusal to be silent. Evelyn told me before she died not to be afraid to speak up. They can take your job, they can take your pride, but they can't take what you put in the food," she said. So I stopped being invisible. So what do you think? Was this justice? Or was it a spectacle that fed on one woman's humiliation to make people feel good about themselves? Did Samuel do it because he loved the taste, or because he wanted to be seen doing the right thing? Did Clara deserve what she got? Or is she also a victim of a system that rewards comfortable lies? Drop a comment. Tell me if you've ever been invisible, or if you watched someone erased and said nothing. Tell me what you would do if you found an old recipe book in a locker. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that talent doesn't require a degree and that sometimes all it takes is one bowl for the truth to be tasted. Subscribe for more stories about people who were overlooked and then refused to be silent. Because out there, someone is still waiting for their moment.